A brutal, calculated prison attack has left King Harris, the son of legendary rapper T.I., fighting for his life in an Atlanta ICU. Doctors say the young man's condition is critical, his chances uncertain, and the next 24 hours will determine whether he survives. But while the Harris family clings to hope inside the cold walls of a hospital, another storm is brewing outside. This is not just a tragedy. It's a story of betrayal, corruption, and conspiracy. And at the center of it all is T.I. himself, no longer just the confident music mogul the world knows, but a broken father who has made a vow of revenge, a promise that those who dared to harm his son will face consequences, not just from the justice system, but from him personally. As news of King Harris's condition spread, Atlanta transformed into a city gripped by sorrow, anger, and fear. Crowds flooded the hospital grounds, holding candles, chanting King's name, and demanding justice. Social media erupted within hours, with hashtags like Pray for King and Justice for King trending globally, uniting fans, celebrities, and communities in grief. But beneath the surface of support lies a darker reality. This was no random act of violence, no spontaneous prison brawl. Sources from inside the facility claimed the assault was deliberate, organized, and executed with chilling precision. Prison cameras, which are supposed to operate around the clock, mysteriously failed at the exact moment of the attack. No footage exists, no evidence remains, only silence. And that silence screams conspiracy. Witnesses whisper of weapons smuggled into the prison, crude yet deadly tools like padlocks tied in socks, swung with devastating force. King was not merely beaten, he was targeted. Reports suggest his skull suffered severe trauma, his brain activity fading in and out, leaving doctors fearing long-term damage, paralysis, or even death. Some insiders claim guards were ordered to stand down to allow the attack to unfold without interference. Others go further, suggesting that the people meant to protect him may have been part of the setup. If true, this isn't just negligence, it is collusion. It means the very system entrusted with safeguarding lives inside those walls instead orchestrated or enabled an attempted murder. Inside the ICU, the Harris family has been living a nightmare. Tiny, King's mother, has been seen collapsing in grief, screaming that they tried to kill her baby. His siblings cling to her, their faces etched with pain that no camera can fully capture. But the most haunting image is of T.I. himself. The man once celebrated as one of hip-hop's strongest voices, now reduced to a father on his knees begging God for his son's life. Those close to the family describe T.I. as shattered, yet unyielding, consumed by rage as much as sorrow. And it is in this crucible of pain that he has made his vow. He has sworn that until those behind the attack on King are held accountable, he will not rest. His promise is not one of patience or reliance on the justice system. His promise is one of revenge. To understand the weight of that vow, we must look at the bigger picture. T.I. has never been a stranger to adversity. From his rise in the Atlanta rap scene to his brushes with law enforcement, he has lived through battles most men could never survive. But this is different. This is not about reputation, record sales, or industry politics. This is about blood. This is about family. And when family is attacked, especially a child, the rules change. T.I.'s vow is more than a father's outburst. It is a declaration, a warning to whoever orchestrated this act that no corner of the system, no amount of power, and no fortress of secrecy will shield them from what is coming. Already, the community is echoing his anger. Protesters outside both the hospital and the prison shout accusations of corruption, demanding accountability from those in charge. One viral video captured a furious supporter screaming at prison officials, "You protect criminals, but you couldn't protect a kid in your custody?" That sentiment resonates across Atlanta and beyond. To many, the attack on King Harris is not just an assault on a young man, but a betrayal by the system itself. It represents everything broken about prisons, power, and corruption.
And T.I.'s vow of revenge speaks directly to that anger, igniting a movement that refuses to let the truth be buried. However,
Tiny's voice was barely a whisper at first. Then it tore through the hospital hallway like a siren. She pressed both hands against the glass of the ICU room, palms white from the pressure, and looked at the machines that were keeping her son half alive. "You promised me family," she said, each word a low, dangerous calm. "You promised me protection. If those men walk away because we waited on a system that won't move, then you can keep everything else. I will not stay married to a man who lets my baby bleed in the dark." The ultimatum hung in the air, not a theatrical threat, but the simple, terrifying arithmetic of a mother who had reached the end of patience. Justice, by any means necessary, or the marriage ends. She paced in the waiting room like a storm contained by thin walls, telling him there were two paths and only one would keep their family intact. "I don't want empty words on camera," she demanded, eyes burning with a grief that had turned into hard resolve. "I want results. I want the people who did this to know they will never feel safe again. You built an empire on being unbroken. Now use whatever it takes to make sure no one ever thinks they can do this to your blood." Her voice grew colder as she spoke. It was not a plea, but a contract she signed with her own survival. Either he answered her call to action, or she would walk away and carry the weight of that choice herself. Tiny didn't frame her demand as vengeance for spectacle. She framed it as the only language the world seemed to understand. "They took his life from him for a little while," she said, folding her arms as if to brace herself against the tide of sorrow. "If you don't force their hands, legally, publicly, any way that actually lands, I will not stand beside a man who lets cowardice be his response. I will not raise our children in the shadow of a silence that cost a child his future." The words were sharp as glass, but underneath them was something softer and fiercer, the raw insistence that love is not complacency, and that protecting family sometimes demands impossible choices. There was no melodrama in Tiny's tone, only the tremor of someone who had run out of hope and found instead a fierce, ugly clarity. "You can be the man who prays and waits," she said, voice low and steady, "or you can be the man who makes sure those who hurt us pay the consequences. If you choose to pray while they walk free, that's your choice. But I am choosing justice." She spelled the choice out like a verdict. "I'll take the hard road alone before I accept a life where my child's blood becomes another headline and nothing changes." As she spoke, the hospital lights cast long, unforgiving shadows across her face. Tiny imagined the headlines, the vigils, the empty rooms, a life that could have been saved if someone had acted. "I don't want war for the sake of war." And for a breath, there was a flash of the mother who had once soothed scraped knees and wiped away tears. "I want accountability. I want the truth. If that truth needs to be forced into the open, then force it. If that means you stand up, fully and without hesitation, do it. If you don't, I will do what I must to protect what's left of my family, even if it means we fall apart." When she finished, there was only silence and the monotonous beeps of the machines. Tiny's ultimatum had been delivered with the terrible dignity of someone who understands the cost of inaction. Whether he answered with fury, strategy, or silence, the die had been cast. Justice at any cost, or the end of the life they once shared. In that sterile corridor, with the world watching and a father broken on his knees, Tiny's demand was a line drawn in the sand, a vow that whatever came next would be shaped by the choice they made in that moment. However, a single phone call can tilt a life into another orbit. For T.I., a man who built an empire out of rhythm and grit, whose name once meant power, protection, and prestige, that phone call came with the sound of machines and the words no parent ever wants to hear. His son, King Harris, beaten in a prison yard, rushed to an ICU with skull trauma and a body someone tried to break. The news spread like wildfire. Candles on sidewalks, vigils under highway overpasses, hashtags of prayer and fury. But for T.I., the public sorrow wasn't the center of the world. The center was a bed lit by harsh fluorescent lights
and the thin, broken rhythm of a son's ventilated breathing. The rest, the headlines, the outrage, the conspiracy theories, blurred around one certainty: someone had deliberately tried to kill his boy. He had once believed money could solve every problem. It bought arenas, men to defend his name, and lawyers who could spin storms into whispers. But this time, money felt like a hollow currency unless it was spent with purpose. The legal system moved slow. The prison bureaucracy offered platitudes and delays. Surveillance tapes malfunctioned. Witnesses vanished in the static between official reports. There was a silence where answers should be, and silence, to a man who had made his life in noise, was unbearable. So T.I. made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He began to sell pieces of his empire: houses, commercial holdings, a prized recording studio left empty and echoing with ghosts. Each deed signed was a quiet war drum. Each wire transfer was a promise. He would not wait for justice to crawl. He would buy it, or he would force it into being. There was a ritual to the liquidation: morning meetings with a trusted accountant, afternoons with attorneys who no longer asked if the move was wise. They only asked how fast they could make it happen. Friends reacted in disbelief. Some called it hysteria, others loyalty. Reporters scribbled about the optics: a mogul downsizing, an empire sacrificed to pay for a personal crusade. T.I. didn't see it as sacrifice. He saw it as investment. If the system refused to protect his son, he would engineer protection of another sort: visibility, pressure, and the resources to pull loose every thread until a hidden tapestry unraveled and showed those who had orchestrated this attack. But what does rage mean when you are the most scrutinized man in a city? T.I.'s first hires were not shadowy figures in back alleys. They were people who could turn rumors into records, private investigators who could coax witnesses from silence, attorneys who could file motions that demanded answers and subpoenaed the records the prison refused to hand over, journalists with reputations for digging where others feared to tread. For every beaten fist fantasy crowds shouted into comment sections, T.I. spent his newly liquidated capital on teams that could hold institutions to account, legally, relentlessly, publicly. He wanted those who prosecuted the silence held to the light and made to flinch. He wanted exposure. He wanted names. He wanted accountability on paper that could not be swept away. Still, the rage inside him did not resolve into neat legal files. Rage is raw. It is a hunger that doubles and morphs. Friends saw it in the way T.I. stopped laughing at old jokes, in the way he slept in the hospital chair, in the way his hands trembled over coffee cups. He began to talk in absolutes. They'll pay. He began to measure time by the hours of the ICU monitors rather than by calendar pages. At night, he imagined faces, not because he knew them, but because the mind needs targets to focus on when chaos surrounds it. There was talk among his closest circle that the mogul who once signed checks to build empires was now willing to sign them away for one concession: that the world would not allow his son to be forgotten. T.I.'s campaign began to change the tenor of the city. Where empathy had been the initial response, outrage began to simmer into organized pressure. Activists demanded hearings. City councilors called emergency sessions. Local prosecutors found themselves on camera promising action. The private investigators dug up inconsistencies, shifts in guard rosters, gaps in the camera feeds, and whispers of threats made the night before the assault. Each discovery was a blade against silence. Each leak sent new tremors through a system that had relied on opacity. The money he'd poured in bought time, and time bought testimony. A quiet courage surfaced in people who had been afraid to speak. Suddenly, names were being said aloud. But every choice has its shadow. As T.I.'s coffers thinned, so too did the world he had known. Houses dwindled in his property portfolio, partners asked questions he didn't want to answer, and men who once moved at his beck and call began to keep their distance. There were whispers about his recklessness. about how a man who had everything would gamble away his future for the hope of retribution. The press painted it as a tragic arc, a king selling his kingdom for a son. The people who had once worshipped his resilience now wondered whether his anger might have been misdirected, whether revenge could erode the very things he wanted to protect. Inside the hospital, King Harris's condition hung between hope and fear. There were moments when machines screamed and nurses rushed, and the family felt the world tilt toward a finality they had not imagined. There were other hours, brief, blessed, when a finger moved, a pulse steadied, a ventilator rhythm faltered and held. T.I. learned to catalog those seconds like treasures. He learned that money could secure expertise, but it could not buy the small mercies of recovery. Yet the money could force transparency, and transparency in a city that had grown complacent was a kind of salvation of its own. Still, the man who had once sold records and renegotiated contracts began to speak in a different language: consequences. It is a dangerous word because it implies action beyond papers. And behind closed doors, as investigators pieced together evidence, T.I. wrestled with questions that had no moral outlines. He asked himself what he would do if the truth led to faces he recognized from older feuds, to names that once defined enemies and alliances. He imagined the court of public opinion and the court of private reckoning. He felt the pull of both justice and retribution, and the distinction between the two blurred more each night. The property sales had bought him leverage, the leverage bought him choices, and choices multiplied the misery of what could be lost. He instructed his teams to pursue every lawful avenue with breakneck intensity. He wanted the prison logs sliced open, the chain of command examined under microscopes, and the hidden financial flows mapped and followed. He wanted anyone who profited from silence exposed. With seasoned lawyers working subpoenas and civil suits, the institution felt pressure like a vice. He had not purchased a hit. He bought the machinery of truth. But truth has its own velocity, and when it began to tumble out, it revealed more than anyone expected. Corrupt deals that reached beyond a single facility, patterns that ran through contractors and suppliers, a network of fear and favors that had allowed ugliness to root beneath the surface. When the first arrests were announced, not in a dramatic midnight raid, but in a precise, almost clinical press conference, the city exhaled. Names were read. Charges were listed. The architecture of silence began to clatter under the weight of hard evidence. For T.I., the moment was not cinematic. It was a slow, small relief, the size of a room where the lights came back on. He watched from the gallery of the courthouse, eyes dry, but voice quiet as he told no one, "It's a start." The sales of his properties had bought more than investigators and lawyers. They had bought a pipeline of truth that officials could no longer ignore. He had weaponized transparency instead of bullets, and in doing so, he found a measure of satisfaction that did not end in ruin. But the cost remained. The assets he let go meant long nights wondering whether he had gambled away more than he could rebuild. The media began to speculate about the future of his empire. Opponents whispered about leverage and vulnerability. Yet when he sat beside King Harris in the quiet hours, watching the boy's breath rise and fall, none of that mattered. The trade, however painful, had felt necessary. He had learned that sometimes the currency of consequence was not cash, but action, not revenge, but insistence. He had bought exposure, forced accountability, and made it impossible for the machine to swallow his son's story. But with every act of defiance comes the risk of escalation. Some warned that T.I.'s oath could ignite a dangerous chain reaction. If the attack was linked to prison gangs, retaliation could spark a war behind bars. If it was orchestrated by rivals in the hip-hop world, it could drag the hip-hop world into a feud with deadly consequences. And if it was part of a larger conspiracy involving corrupt officials, T.I.'s push for vengeance could place his entire family in even greater danger. The vow, while powerful, is also perilous. It is both a symbol of a father's love and a spark that could set entire institutions ablaze. Speculation grows daily. Some believe the attack was a warning shot aimed at T.I. himself, a message that even fame and fortune cannot protect his bloodline. Others suggest King stumbled onto secrets inside the prison, hidden dealings, illegal trades, or corrupt alliances that made him a target. Darker whispers point to old grudges, enemies from T.I.'s past who found their chance for revenge by striking his son. Whatever the truth, one fact is undeniable. King Harris was not simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was chosen. He was marked. And T.I.'s vow of vengeance stems from that knowledge that this was no accident, but an attack designed to wound him at his core. Meanwhile, Atlanta has become a city of prayers and protests. Vigils grow larger each night, with thousands of fans lighting candles, holding posters of King, and chanting his name into the night sky. Social media is flooded with messages of solidarity, but also with conspiracy theories that stretch from prison gangs to industry power struggles. Each new whisper, each leaked report adds another layer of suspicion, another question left unanswered. And with each day that passes without clarity, T.I.'s vow of revenge feels less like a threat and more like an inevitability. The silence of authorities, their failure to provide answers, only fuels the belief that the truth is being buried and that justice may never come through official channels. Inside the hospital, the fight for King's life continues. Doctors warn that even if he survives, he may never be the same. Brain damage, memory loss, paralysis, these are all terrifying possibilities that haunt the family's every breath. Yet through it all, T.I. remains steadfast, by his son's bedside, holding his hand, refusing to leave. His vow is not made in anger alone. It is made in love. Love for his son, love for his family, and love for the idea that no one should ever be able to inflict this kind of pain without consequence. His words echo not just as a father's cry, but as a battle line drawn in the sand. So now, the world waits. We wait for news from inside the ICU. We wait for answers from prison officials who remain silent. We wait to see whether justice will come from the system or from T.I. himself. This is no longer just the story of a prison fight. It is a cultural earthquake shaking Atlanta, shaking hip-hop, and shaking millions of fans worldwide. It is the story of a father's vow, born in heartbreak, sharpened by rage, and aimed squarely at those who dared to harm his son. And as Atlanta holds its breath, one thing is certain. This vow will not be forgotten. T.I. has spoken, and until the attackers are brought down, he will not rest.